The Girl of Ink and Stars, Chapter 22. What are you doing? I was rising, my body pulled upwards. What the hell do you think you are doing? It was Lupe, shouting at me, dragging me, my arm across her shoulders as heat sent the air railing around us. Cracks were opening in the walls and she squeezed us through, my head knocking on the rock. Now I could feel the pain, all of it, through my back and shoulders, cutting across my legs, tearing at my head. It did not matter that Ma's map of the forgotten territories lay in shreds in my pocket. It was like carrying a map of the journey on my skin, each scrape a path that drew us further on, each bruise a reminder. And Yote's words burnt into my brain, a line of white-hot beads threaded deep inside. You're too late. The ground gave an enormous wrench, and I felt Lupe carrying us forward, even as a chasm opened beneath her feet. We curled ourselves into a tight tangle of limbs and dropped like stones. I wished for the end to be quick, to smash us against a rock or into fire, but instead we clattered painfully downwards. The labyrinth would not release us. Yote wanted us in the depths of his maze, where no light beyond his could reach. The rocks grew smooth under my back. A roaring sound filled my ears, like water and fire and wind all mixed up together. But the shaking had stopped. I stopped rolling. I turned onto my side so I could see Lupe, my head spinning, the woodlight jutting painfully into my hip. We seemed to be in another cave, but this one stretched high, the ceiling out of sight. Are you all right? I'm getting used to falling down things. Her face was pale. I wish the ground would stop moving. How did you get to me? I shifted the rocks. I noticed her hands were covered in cuts, her fingernails shredded, her thin legs scraped. How had she carried me? Isa, what happened back there? I thought you were dead. So did I joked, but I could not tell her about the peeling away, the two selves, speaking to Yote. She would not believe me. I did not know if I believed myself. I think I must have fainted, but I was saved from coming up with an explanation because Lupe was no longer paying attention. Her eyes were fixed behind me. Isa, turn around. She looked as she had in the crystal cave. I followed her gaze and felt my jaw drop. Behind me, inches away, a black fire was cascading, a waterfall, a firefall held in place by an invisible barrier. But the fire was not only travelling down, it was also pushing upwards, outwards, swirling this way and that, as if we had fallen beneath the sea, were watching it churn through glass. Glass. I crawled forward. No, Lupe shouted. What are you doing? It's all right, I said. Watch. I pressed the woodlight slowly into the black fire. Lupe gasped as the surface gave slightly, like the skin on milk. Then she pulled herself forward so that we lay side by side on our bellies. This is incredible. What is this stuff? It's glass, I replied. Glass? She frowned. Like the windows in my house? Yes. But how is it here? That roaring sound, the sound like the sea. It's molten sand. Da, I told you, of course. But how does it work? It's sand. We must be under a beach. When you melt it, it forms glass. I'm not sure how exactly. This is black because of the bits of shell in the sand. Isn't sand always bits of shell? And other things, like crystals. I frowned at her. I thought you wanted me to tell you. I do. Dar said that if you looked at glass close up, it would look like everything it's made of melted together. Sand too. Sand would look like tiny shells. How does he know? I flushed. He's just guessing, but it would make sense. I waited for her to mock me, but she only said, I'd like to see sand close up. We watched the fire churn, silent a while. Then Lupe asked, does glass melt then? I knew what she was really asking. I suppose it must, if it's made by melting. Yes, she said, doesn't seem fair, does it? To be so close to the sea and not reach it. Bit like being back in Gramera, I said. Her fierce grin faded, I suppose. We watched the glass. Not long left now. Soon it would shatter or melt, and there would be nothing between us and Yote's flames. What happened then? Lupe asked, in that way she had of picking up a conversation long dropped. Did you fall, or? I don't know, I said quietly. I was sure I had heard Yote, sure I had left my body, but it wasn't possible. It didn't matter now. Nothing mattered. Nothing would matter ever again. I don't want to talk about it. Lupe took my hand. How about I tell you a story? A story or a myth? I asked slyly. But she only put on a serious face and said, definitely a story. All right. She cleared her throat theatrically. Once there was a girl. This girl was a map maker's daughter, but she insisted on everyone calling it cartography or something, and she thought her stories were the best and didn't want anyone else to tell them. I jabbed her hard in the side. That wasn't really the story, she spluttered. I guessed. The glass made a grinding sound and we jumped. There was no crack yet, but the shift and slide was more obvious now. Better hurry, I said. We sat cross-legged in front of each other. Lupe began again. Once there was a country where a kind king and queen reigned. One day, the queen decided to go on a tour of her lands. She set off alone on a horse, for she was a strong rider. But a couple of days later, the king received a message from the village she was expected at first. She had never arrived. The king rode for days, visiting village after village, enlisting more people to help him search for her. A week passed, and the king collapsed, exhausted. They could not find his wife. The loss turned the king mad. The trees stopped bearing fruit, and the rivers turned brown in their beds. The people wilted, grey as the sky. But this was not enough suffering for the king. He ordered higher taxes and organised troops of soldiers to visit other nearby lands and bring back map makers. He became obsessed with charting his country. Map maker after map maker came, but they were never good enough. The king wanted the maps to be bigger, more detailed. Then his men brought him a cartographer from the east, a clever, kind man who realised how much pain the king was in and vowed to do his best to help him. The cartographer came up with an idea. He proposed making a map without a scale, or rather, a map to the exact scale of the land. How do you know what a scale is? I couldn't help myself. Lupe regarded me wearily. I do listen, you know. As if on cue, the glass creaked. I spun around, but before I could look, Lupe grabbed my arms. It's better not to look. Trust me. I nodded, holding her gaze. She took my hand again and continued, talking faster. The first thing a map maker needs are paper and ink and to read the stars. While the cartographer made star charts, great nets were set out across the forest to catch each insect. They were crushed to make different colours, and soon the cartographer had 100 vats of ink to use. Then the forests were felled to clear the view of the sky. Tree after tree was mashed with gallons of river water to make the paper. All the animals died and people began to be poisoned by the soiled river water, but the king did not care. He only wanted to find his wife. The cartographer began. He started at the western shore, laying down the paper and marking it with where the houses and roads and rivers were. Then he covered the crops with paper. They died from lack of sun, but still the king did not care. His subjects began to leave the land and sailed to other countries to be ruled by men less mad and less cruel. Soon, only the king and his cartographer remained. The map was almost done when the cartographer found the skeletons of the queen and her horse on a remote stretch of coast. He rode across the paper miles to tell the king. The king was so overcome with grief that his heart began to burst. The doctor had fled the place long ago, and so there was nothing to be done. He died in the cartographer's arms. She stopped. I shuddered. What happened to the map? Lupe let out a bark of laughter. Only you would ask what happened to the map. I waited. But what did? She shrugged. I don't know. The rain broke it to pieces, or the cartographer made it into a paper ship and sailed out to sea. Really? You know it's just a story. Yes. I paused. It was the best story I've ever heard. Who told you it? She grinned broadly. You did? No, really? You, she repeated, softer this time. My smile faded. What? You made it up for my birthday 3 years ago when we first became friends. You made me a map to the rabbit's warren and you sat by it while you told me. I liked it so much, I wrote it down when I got home. You really don't remember? I shook my head slowly. I only remembered realising too late that I didn't have a present for Lupe and telling her the first thing that came into my mind. I had no idea she liked it enough to memorise it, let alone write it down. I read it all the time at home. It has your favourite things, adventure, maps, and a sad ending, I added. And that. The glass creaked. And this time Lupe was too slow to stop me looking. Near the top, where the glass was thickest, a crack had split the pane like a fissure in rock. A flame licked the centre of the line, and the glass bubbled. We broke away from each other, throwing ourselves backwards. The flames had not yet come through, but whole swathes of the surface were sliding down, bubbling into a threatening pool at the bottom. I backed right up against the opposite wall of the glass-fronted cave. Something jabbed into my head. Ouch! My fingers came away, sticky with blood. Lupe staunched the flow with her raggedy dress. What happened? I hit my head. What on? I snatched the woodlight from my belt and held it up to the wall. Jutting from the surface was a shadowy shape. It looked like an irregular piece of rock, only lighter. But when I held the woodlight closer, it glinted. It was not rock at all. It was metal.